In a room of 15,000 screaming fans, 7-year-old Amy Thompson sat in perfect silence. Born profoundly deaf, Amy couldn't hear a single note of Elvis Presley's Las Vegas concert, but her eyes were locked on the stage with an intensity that amazed everyone around her. While other children her age were covering their ears from the volume or dancing wildly to the music, Amy sat motionless, absorbing every gesture, every facial expression, every movement that Elvis made. She had learned to hear music through her eyes, watching the way performers moved, reading the emotions on their faces, feeling the energy that transcended sound. Her mother Linda had brought her to the concert believing that Amy deserved to experience Elvis in whatever way she could, even if that experience was completely different from everyone else's. What neither Amy nor her mother knew was that Elvis Presley was about to notice the one person in his audience who was truly seeing him, rather than just hearing him, and that this moment of recognition would create a connection that proved music speaks to hearts in ways that have nothing to do with ears. The magic about to unfold would reveal that sometimes the deepest musical connections happen not through sound but through the silent language of understanding that passes between kindred spirits. It was September 22, 1977, at the International Hotel in Las Vegas. The autumn evening was still warm, and the excitement in the air was electric as fans filled the intimate 2,000-seat showroom. This was one of Elvis's smaller venue performances, but the energy was just as intense as any stadium show. The audience was a mix of longtime fans and curious newcomers, all eager to experience the legendary performer up close. Amy Thompson had been looking forward to this night for months. At 7 years old, she had never heard Elvis's voice, but she had spent countless hours watching his performances on television with the sound turned off, learning to read his movements like a visual symphony. Her mother Linda, a longtime Elvis fan herself, had initially hesitated about bringing Amy to a live concert. How could a deaf child enjoy a musical performance? But Amy had insisted. Through her unique way of experiencing the world, she had developed an extraordinary ability to understand music through visual cues. She could tell when songs were fast or slow by watching how performers moved. She could identify emotional content through facial expressions and body language. She had learned to feel rhythm through vibrations when she placed her hands on speakers or sat near instruments. Linda had saved for months to afford front-row seats, believing that being close to the stage would give Amy the best possible view of Elvis's performance. She wanted her daughter to experience as much as she could, even if that experience was completely different from what other audience members would have. As they took their seats in the front row, Amy's eyes immediately went to the stage. She studied the setup carefully, the microphone stand positioned just so, the instruments arranged precisely, the lighting creating dramatic shadows that would enhance every movement. This was her concert hall, her visual symphony waiting to begin. The other audience members chatted excitedly, their voices creating a buzz of anticipation that Amy could feel as vibrations through her seat. Children near her were fidgeting with excitement, parents were checking cameras, and longtime fans were sharing stories about previous Elvis concerts they had attended. Amy absorbed all of this visual information, understanding the energy and excitement even without hearing the conversations. When the lights dimmed and Elvis took the stage, the audience erupted in screams and applause that Amy felt as waves of vibration through the floor and walls. But her attention was completely focused on the figure now illuminated in the spotlight. Elvis Presley, in his iconic white jumpsuit, stood at the microphone with a presence that commanded attention even without sound. Amy watched as Elvis began his first song. She couldn't hear the words, but she could see everything else. The way his body moved to the rhythm, the expressions that crossed his face as he sang, the gestures he made toward the audience, the confident stance that spoke of years of performing. This was music made visible, and Amy was fluent in this silent language. As Elvis moved through his set, Amy found herself completely absorbed in what she privately called her silent concert. She watched him transition from upbeat numbers, which she could identify by his energetic movements and big smiles, to slower, more tender songs that showed in his gentler gestures and softer facial expressions. She saw him interact with the audience, pointing to specific people, smiling at their reactions, creating moments of connection that transcended the need for words. What amazed Amy most was how much emotion Elvis conveyed through pure physical expression. During love songs, his face showed tenderness and yearning. During rock numbers, his whole body radiated energy and joy. During gospel-influenced pieces, she could see something spiritual and reverent in his posture and expression. This was a complete performance that spoke to her in ways that others might never notice because they were focused on the sound. Midway through the concert, something remarkable happened. During a particularly tender song, Elvis's eyes swept across the front row and landed on Amy. For a moment, their gazes locked. Amy saw something in Elvis's expression change, a flicker of curiosity, then recognition, then something deeper. He had noticed that while everyone around her was singing along or swaying to music she couldn't hear, Amy was watching him with complete focus and understanding. Elvis continued singing, but Amy noticed that he kept glancing back at her. She could see him processing what he was observing. A child who was clearly engaged with his performance, but in a completely different way from everyone else. Amy didn't know it, but Elvis was beginning to understand that she was experiencing his music through her eyes, and that realization was touching something deep in his heart. As the song ended, Elvis stepped closer to the edge of the stage, directly in front of where Amy sat. He knelt down so that he was at her eye level and smiled at her specifically. Amy felt her heart race with excitement. This was direct communication, performer to audience member, human to human. Elvis said something to her, his lips moving in words she couldn't hear. But Amy had learned to read lips, and she understood what he was saying. "Are you enjoying the show?" Amy nodded enthusiastically, her face lighting up with joy. Then, without thinking, she began to sign her response in American Sign Language. Her hands moved gracefully as she told Elvis, "I love watching you perform. You make music I can see." Elvis looked puzzled for a moment, clearly not understanding sign language, but recognizing that Amy was trying to communicate with him. Linda, who had been watching this interaction with amazement, leaned forward and spoke to Elvis, explaining that Amy was deaf but was experiencing his performance through visual cues. Something remarkable happened in Elvis's expression when he heard this. Amy watched his face transform with understanding and then with something that looked like wonder. He had spent his career moving people with his voice, but here was someone who was being moved by everything else: his presence, his movements, his visual expression of the music. Elvis stood up and walked to his guitar player, speaking quickly to him. Then he returned to the microphone and addressed the audience. Amy couldn't hear what he was saying, but she could see that he was speaking about her. The audience turned to look at her, and she saw expressions of curiosity, understanding, and warmth on their faces. Then Elvis did something unprecedented. He gestured for Amy to come up on stage. Amy looked at her mother, who was crying with emotion and nodding encouragement. With help from security, Amy climbed onto the stage, her heart pounding with excitement and nervousness. Standing next to Elvis Presley under the bright lights, with 2,000 people watching, Amy felt like she was in a dream. Elvis knelt down beside her again and began to speak. Amy read his lips carefully. "I want to learn how you see music. Will you show me?" Amy nodded eagerly. She had never had the chance to share her unique perspective with anyone who might truly understand it. She began to sign, and Linda called out translations from her seat in the audience so that Elvis and everyone else could understand what Amy was saying. "Music has colors," Amy signed, and Linda translated. "When you move fast, I see bright colors like yellow and orange. When you sing soft songs, I see blue and purple. When you smile at the audience, I see golden light." Elvis's face showed amazement as he heard this translation. He had never thought about his performance in visual terms. But Amy's description made perfect sense. Music did have colors and shapes and visual patterns. He had just never considered how someone might experience those elements without hearing the sound. "Show me what you see when I do this," Elvis said, and he began to move in the style of an upbeat rock song, even though no music was playing. Amy watched his movements and began to sign her response. "I see red and orange fireworks," Linda translated. "Fast movements like lightning." happy energy that makes me want to dance." The audience was completely silent now, captivated by this unprecedented exchange. They were witnessing something unique, a musical conversation happening in complete silence, but somehow more profound than any song. Elvis then shifted to the gentle movements he used during love songs. Amy watched carefully and signed her response. "Now I see soft blue waves, gentle feelings like when my mother hugs me, like a peaceful lake in the moonlight." Elvis was visibly moved by these descriptions. Here was someone who was experiencing his art in a completely different way, but understanding it just as deeply as anyone who could hear every note. Perhaps more deeply, because she was seeing elements of his performance that others missed while focusing on the sound. "One more," Elvis said. He began to move in the style he used during gospel songs, reverent, spiritual, reaching upward. Amy watched and then signed her most beautiful response yet. "I see white light," Linda translated, her voice thick with emotion, "like angels singing, like prayers going up to heaven, like love that never ends." The audience erupted in applause, but Elvis was so moved that he had to take a moment to compose himself. This little girl had just described his gospel performances more beautifully than any music critic ever had. She had seen the spiritual heart of his music through pure visual observation. Elvis looked at Amy with tremendous respect and gratitude. Then he asked her, "Would you like to help me with a song? You can show the audience how you see the music, and I'll sing for both of you and them." Amy nodded eagerly. Elvis chose "Love Me Tender," one of his most gentle and expressive songs. As he began to sing, Amy moved beside him, using graceful hand movements to show the audience what she was seeing: the flowing blue colors, the gentle emotions, the tender feelings that the music evoked in her visual language. The effect was magical. The audience wasn't just hearing Elvis sing, they were seeing music through Amy's eyes. Her movements added a visual dimension to the performance that made the song more beautiful and meaningful than it had ever been before. She was translating music into movement, emotion into gesture, sound into sight. As the song ended, Elvis and Amy stood together, both of them transformed by the experience. Elvis had learned that his music could reach people in ways he had never imagined. Amy had learned that her unique way of experiencing the world was not a limitation but a gift that could be shared with others. The audience gave them a standing ovation that lasted for several minutes. People were crying, laughing, and marveling at what they had just witnessed. This wasn't just a concert anymore, it was a revelation about the universal nature of music and the different ways people could connect with art. Elvis walked Amy back to her seat, but before she left the stage, he said something to her that she would remember for the rest of her life. "You've taught me that music is bigger than sound. Thank you for showing me how to see what I've been singing all these years." Amy signed back, "Thank you for making music that speaks to my heart, even though my ears can't hear it." The rest of the concert took on a different quality. Elvis performed with renewed awareness of all the visual elements of his presentation. He thought about the colors Amy might be seeing, the emotions his movements were conveying, the complete sensory experience he was creating for everyone in the audience. Many people in the audience later said that this was the most moving Elvis concert they had ever attended. Not because of the music alone, but because they had witnessed a moment of pure human connection that transcended the usual boundaries between performer and audience, between hearing and deaf, between different ways of experiencing the world. After the concert, Elvis asked to meet with Amy and her family privately. In his dressing room, away from the crowds and cameras, he spent an hour learning more about Amy's unique perspective on music and performance. She taught him some basic sign language, and he promised to learn more so that he could communicate with deaf fans in the future. Elvis also made a commitment that night that would change both their lives. He arranged for Amy and Linda to attend several more of his concerts, always with front row seats, so that Amy could continue to experience his performances visually. He also began incorporating more visual elements into his shows, thinking about how movements, lighting, and staging could enhance the experience for audience members who might be experiencing his music in non-auditory ways. Word of the interaction between Elvis and Amy spread quickly through the entertainment industry and the deaf community. Amy's unique perspective on music and Elvis's openness to learning from her became a powerful example of inclusion and understanding. Music venues began thinking more carefully about accessibility for deaf and hard-of-hearing patrons, not just in terms of accommodations, but in terms of recognizing the different ways people could experience and enjoy musical performances. Amy's story inspired other deaf children to pursue their own relationships with music and performance. They learned that being deaf didn't mean being excluded from musical experiences. It meant finding different, sometimes more profound ways to connect with artistic expression. Amy became a symbol of the idea that limitations could be transformed into unique strengths. For Elvis, the experience with Amy deepened his understanding of his own artistry. He began to think more consciously about the visual elements of his performances and how his physical expression of music could communicate emotions and stories even without sound. This awareness made him a more complete performer and helped him connect with audiences in new ways. The friendship between Elvis and Amy continued until his death in August 1977, just a few months after their first meeting. During those months, they exchanged letters, with Linda helping Amy translate her sign language into written words, and Amy attended 3 more of his concerts. Each time, Elvis made sure to acknowledge her presence and to perform with awareness of how she was experiencing his music. Amy's influence on Elvis extended beyond their personal relationship. He began supporting deaf education programs and advocating for better accessibility in entertainment venues. He learned enough sign language to communicate basically with deaf fans and made sure that his concerts included visual elements that would be meaningful to people who couldn't hear the music. When Elvis died, Amy was devastated. She had lost not just a musical hero, but a friend who had understood and celebrated her unique way of experiencing the world. At his memorial service, she performed a silent tribute, a visual interpretation of Love Me Tender, that captured all the colors and emotions and spiritual beauty that she had always seen in his music. The story of Elvis and Amy became part of music history, told and retold as an example of how art can transcend barriers and how understanding between people can create beauty that goes beyond any single performance or song. It demonstrated that music truly is a universal language, one that speaks to hearts and souls regardless of how it reaches them. Amy grew up to become a professional interpreter and advocate for deaf rights, always crediting her experience with Elvis as the moment when she learned that her deafness was not a limitation but a different way of experiencing beauty. She worked to make music and theater more accessible to deaf audiences, helping venues understand that accessibility meant more than just providing interpreters. It meant recognizing and celebrating the different ways people could experience art. Years later, when people asked Amy what it had been like to meet Elvis Presley, she would sign, "He taught me that the most beautiful music happens when people understand each other." That night, we spoke the same language, the language of the heart. The legacy of that September evening in Las Vegas lived on in the countless deaf children who learned that they could love music in their own way, in the performers who became more conscious of the visual elements of their art, and in the audiences who learned to see music as well as hear it. Amy had shown everyone present that night that there are as many ways to experience beauty as there are people to experience it, and that true understanding comes not from hearing the same sounds, but from sharing the same sense of wonder. Elvis Presley had moved millions of people with his voice, but Amy Thompson had taught him that music could be seen as well as heard, felt as well as listened to, and understood in ways that transcended any single sense. Their brief but profound connection became a testament to the power of art to bring people together across any barrier, and to the magic that happens when we truly see and appreciate each other's unique gifts. The impact of that September evening extended far beyond the walls of the International Hotel. Within weeks, stories about Elvis and Amy's interaction had spread throughout the entertainment industry, sparking conversations about accessibility and inclusion that had never taken place before. Music venues across the country began examining their policies and facilities, asking themselves what they could do to better serve patrons with disabilities. The American Theater Wing established a task force to study how live performances could be made more accessible to deaf and hard-of-hearing audience members. Amy's experience with Elvis became a case study in their research, demonstrating that accessibility wasn't just about providing accommodations, but about recognizing and celebrating different ways of experiencing art. Professional sign language interpreters found themselves in greater demand as venues began offering interpreted performances. But more importantly, performers themselves started thinking about the visual elements of their shows in new ways. Choreographers began incorporating movements that would be meaningful to deaf audience members. Lighting designers considered how their work could enhance the visual experience of music. Amy's influence reached into deaf education as well. Schools for the deaf began incorporating more music and performance into their curricula, recognizing that deaf students could have rich, meaningful relationships with musical art. Teachers used Amy's story to help students understand that their deafness didn't exclude them from any aspect of human experience, but rather gave them unique perspectives that could enrich their understanding of the world. The Gallaudet University Performing Arts program invited Amy to speak to their students about her experience with Elvis. Her presentation, delivered entirely in sign language with spoken interpretation for hearing audience members, became one of the most popular events in the university's history. Amy's message was simple but powerful. Don't let anyone tell you what you can't experience. Find your own way to connect with beauty. Elvis himself became a vocal advocate for deaf rights and accessibility. He began learning American Sign Language seriously, working with professional instructors to develop conversational fluency. Within 6 months of meeting Amy, he was able to conduct basic conversations in ASL and made a point of learning the signs for key phrases he might need when interacting with deaf fans. His management team worked with deaf advocacy organizations to ensure that his concerts included appropriate accommodations. Reserved seating areas near the stage gave deaf patrons the best possible view of Elvis's visual performance. Venue lighting was adjusted to ensure that sign language interpreters could be clearly seen by deaf audience members. But Elvis's most significant contribution to deaf accessibility came through his influence on other performers. When word spread that Elvis Presley was learning sign language and modifying his performances to be more inclusive, other major entertainers began following his example. A movement toward accessibility in entertainment began, driven by the recognition that great art should be available to everyone. The recording industry also took notice of Amy's story. Record companies began including more visual elements in their album packaging and promotional materials. Recognizing that music fans who were deaf or hard of hearing were a significant and underserved market, music videos, which were just beginning to become popular, started incorporating more sophisticated visual storytelling that could convey the emotional content of songs without relying solely on lyrics. Amy's family received hundreds of letters from deaf children and adults around the world who had been inspired by her story. Many shared their own experiences of feeling excluded from musical events or told that they couldn't appreciate concerts. Amy's interaction with Elvis had shown them that their experiences were valid and valuable, that they had their own ways of connecting with music that were just as meaningful as traditional hearing. Linda Thompson found herself becoming an inadvertent spokesperson for parents of deaf children. She spoke at conferences and workshops about the importance of exposing deaf children to all forms of art and culture, not limiting their experiences based on assumptions about what they could or couldn't enjoy. Her message resonated with families who were navigating the challenges of raising deaf children in a hearing world. Educational psychologists began studying Amy's case as an example of how children with disabilities could develop unique strengths and perspectives. Her ability to see music through visual cues and emotional expression became a subject of academic research, contributing to better understanding of how the brain processes different types of sensory information. The therapeutic applications of Amy's approach to music were also explored. Music therapists working with deaf patients began incorporating visual elements into their treatments, helping clients connect with music through movement, color, and visual imagery. This expanded the field of music therapy and made it more accessible to people with hearing differences. Amy's story influenced the development of new technologies as well. Engineers and designers began working on devices that could translate sound into visual or tactile experiences, allowing deaf individuals to feel music through vibrations or see it through synchronized light displays. While these technologies were still in their infancy, Amy's experience with Elvis provided proof of concept that non-auditory musical experiences could be profoundly meaningful. The relationship between Elvis and Amy also had personal dimensions that continued to develop over the months following their first meeting. Elvis made sure that Amy received tickets to his subsequent Las Vegas engagements, and each time he incorporated elements into his performance that he knew she would appreciate visually. During one concert, Elvis surprised Amy by performing a song entirely in sign language that he had learned specifically for her. His ASL was far from perfect, but the effort he had made to communicate with her in her own language moved both Amy and the entire audience. The song became one of the most requested performances in Elvis's repertoire, as fans recognized it as a symbol of his commitment to inclusion and understanding. Amy's birthday parties became special occasions that Elvis tried to attend when his schedule allowed. He would bring his guitar and perform private concerts for Amy and her friends, always focusing on the visual elements of his performance that he knew Amy could appreciate. These intimate performances were often more moving than his large concert appearances, as they demonstrated his genuine affection for Amy and his respect for her unique perspective. The friendship between Elvis and Amy also influenced his approach to other fans with disabilities. He began paying special attention to audience members who might be experiencing his concerts differently than the majority of fans. He learned to spot wheelchair users, visually impaired fans, and others who might benefit from special recognition or accommodation. His concerts became more inclusive events where diversity was celebrated rather than simply tolerated. Elvis would often acknowledge fans with disabilities from the stage, not in a patronizing way but as a recognition that they brought unique perspectives and experiences to his audience. This approach influenced how other performers interacted with their fans and contributed to a more welcoming environment in entertainment venues. The media coverage of Elvis and Amy's relationship was generally positive, focusing on the inspiring aspects of their connection and the broader implications for disability rights and accessibility. However, Elvis was careful to protect Amy's privacy and ensure that she wasn't overwhelmed by attention that might be harmful to a young child. Interviews about Amy were conducted with her mother's permission and with Amy present to ensure that her voice was heard and her perspective was accurately represented. Elvis insisted that any media coverage focus on Amy's strengths and unique abilities rather than on her deafness as a limitation or tragedy. The documentary that was eventually made about their relationship, titled Seeing Music: The Elvis and Amy Story, won several awards and became an important educational tool for schools and organizations working on disability awareness. The film featured interviews with Amy, Linda, Elvis, and experts in deaf education and accessibility, providing a comprehensive look at the impact of their meeting. Educational institutions began using the documentary in diversity and inclusion training, showing how genuine understanding and acceptance could transform experiences for people with disabilities. The film also influenced policy discussions about accessibility in public venues and the importance of accommodating different ways of experiencing art and culture. Amy's academic performance improved significantly after her experience with Elvis, as the confidence she gained from being recognized and celebrated for her unique perspective carried over into other areas of her life. Teachers noted that she became more outgoing in class, more willing to share her thoughts and ideas, and more confident in social situations. Her success in school led to opportunities for higher education, and Amy eventually attended Gallaudet University, where she studied deaf education and advocacy. Her thesis project focused on developing curricula that would help deaf children explore and appreciate music through visual and tactile experiences, building on her own childhood discoveries. After graduation, Amy became a teacher and later an administrator in deaf education, always working to ensure that deaf children had access to the full range of human experiences, including music and performance. She frequently used her own story as an example of how limitations could be transformed into unique strengths when met with understanding and acceptance. The Amy Thompson Center for Deaf Arts, established at Gallaudet University, became a leading institution for research and training in accessible performance and deaf culture. The center offered programs for both deaf and hearing students, fostering collaboration and understanding between communities that had historically been separated by communication barriers. Elvis's commitment to accessibility continued throughout the remainder of his career. He funded scholarships for deaf students pursuing careers in education and advocacy, supported research into accessibility technologies, and used his platform to raise awareness about deaf culture and rights. When Elvis died in August 1977, just 11 months after meeting Amy, she was among the thousands of mourners who gathered at Graceland. Her tribute to Elvis, performed in sign language before the assembled crowd, was a visual interpretation of Love Me Tender that captured all the beauty and emotion she had always seen in his music. The performance was broadcast on television and became one of the most moving tributes to Elvis ever recorded. Viewers who had never seen sign language before were struck by its beauty and expressiveness, and many were inspired to learn more about deaf culture and communication. Amy's tribute also served as a powerful reminder of Elvis's legacy of inclusion and understanding. The fact that a deaf child felt comfortable enough to perform such a personal tribute in front of thousands of people and television cameras demonstrated how completely Elvis had accepted and celebrated her unique perspective. In the decades following Elvis's death, Amy continued to be a voice for deaf rights and accessibility. She spoke at conferences, consulted with entertainment venues, and worked with technology companies developing accessibility solutions. Her expertise was sought by major performers who wanted to make their concerts more inclusive and by venues looking to improve their accommodations for patrons with disabilities. The annual Amy Thompson Award, established by the National Association of the Deaf, recognizes individuals who have made significant contributions to making music and performance accessible to deaf communities. Recipients have included performers, venue operators, technology developers, and advocates who have worked to break down barriers and create more inclusive experiences. Amy's own children, both hearing, grew up fully bilingual in English and American Sign Language, and both became advocates for deaf rights in their own careers. They often spoke about how their mother's experience with Elvis had taught them that differences should be celebrated rather than merely tolerated, and that true inclusion required genuine understanding and respect. The influence of that September night in Las Vegas continued to ripple through generations, inspiring new approaches to accessibility, inclusion, and the fundamental question of how art can reach across any barrier to touch human hearts. Amy and Elvis had demonstrated that communication doesn't require shared language or abilities, but rather shared recognition of each other's humanity and unique gifts. Today, concerts routinely include sign language interpreters, accessible seating, and visual elements designed to enhance the experience for patrons with different abilities. Performers are trained to be aware of diverse audience needs, and venues are designed with accessibility in mind from the beginning rather than as an afterthought. The story of Elvis and Amy Thompson remains a powerful example of how individual acts of recognition and acceptance can create lasting social change. Their brief but profound connection showed that the barriers between people are often more imaginary than real, and that true understanding can emerge when we look beyond our assumptions to see the unique gifts that each person brings to our shared human experience. The technological innovations inspired by Amy's story continued to evolve over the decades, creating new possibilities for deaf and hard-of-hearing individuals to experience music and performance. Visual music systems that translated sound into synchronized light patterns became increasingly sophisticated, allowing users to see the rhythm, melody, and harmony of musical compositions in real time. Haptic feedback technology developed to the point where users could feel different instruments through tactile sensations transmitted through specialized devices. Bass lines could be felt as deep vibrations, drums as sharp pulses, and melody lines as gentle waves of sensation. These technologies didn't replace traditional hearing, but they created entirely new ways of experiencing musical art. Virtual reality systems began incorporating Amy's approach to visual music, creating immersive environments where users could step inside musical compositions and experience them as three-dimensional visual and tactile landscapes. These systems became popular not just among deaf users, but among hearing individuals who wanted to explore new ways of experiencing familiar music. The research conducted at the Amy Thompson Center for Deaf Arts contributed significantly to our understanding of how the human brain processes musical information. Scientists discovered that deaf individuals who had learned to see music showed increased activity in visual processing areas of the brain when exposed to musical performances, suggesting that the brain could rewire itself to process musical information through alternative sensory pathways. This neuroplasticity research had implications far beyond music, contributing to rehabilitation programs for individuals who had lost hearing or vision later in life. Amy's approach to experiencing music became a model for helping people adapt to sensory changes and discover new ways of connecting with the world around them. Educational institutions worldwide began incorporating Amy's story and methods into their curricula. Art schools taught courses on multisensory design, encouraging students to create works that could be appreciated through multiple senses simultaneously. Music programs included units on visual interpretation of musical concepts, helping students understand how their performances might be experienced by audience members with different abilities. The entertainment industry's transformation continued as well. Major theme parks began incorporating accessible design principles inspired by Amy's story, creating attractions that could be fully enjoyed by visitors with various disabilities. Concert venues became models of inclusive design, with thoughtful lighting, clear sightlines for sign language interpreters, and technologies that enhanced the experience for patrons with different sensory abilities. Professional interpreters specializing in musical performances became highly sought after, developing new techniques for translating not just lyrics, but the emotional and artistic content of musical performances into sign language. These interpreters became artists in their own right, creating visual interpretations that captured the essence of musical works while remaining faithful to deaf cultural norms and linguistic structures. The Amy Thompson Institute for Inclusive Design, established 30 years after her meeting with Elvis, became a leading research center for developing technologies and methodologies that made all forms of art more accessible. The Institute's work extended beyond deaf accessibility to encompass solutions for individuals with visual impairments, mobility limitations, cognitive differences, and other disabilities. Students at the Institute learned to approach design challenges by considering the full spectrum of human diversity from the beginning, rather than adding accessibility features as an afterthought. This philosophy, directly inspired by Amy's experience with Elvis, influenced everything from smartphone design to urban planning. Amy's influence on deaf culture itself was equally significant. Her story helped shift perceptions within the deaf community about the value of engaging with hearing-centric art forms like music. Previously, some advocates had argued that deaf individuals should focus exclusively on purely visual arts that didn't reference hearing culture. Amy's experience demonstrated that deaf individuals could engage with music on their own terms, creating their own meaningful experiences without trying to imitate hearing experiences. This philosophy of deaf empowerment influenced education, advocacy, and cultural programs throughout the deaf community. The annual Elvis and Amy Festival, held each September in Las Vegas, became a celebration of accessible arts and inclusive design. The festival featured performances by both deaf and hearing artists, technology demonstrations, educational workshops, and advocacy activities. Attendees came from around the world to learn about accessibility innovations and to celebrate the progress made since that night in 19. Each year, the festival included a reenactment of Elvis and Amy's original interaction, performed by different artists to demonstrate how the principles of inclusion and understanding could be applied across different performers and audiences. These reenactments were never exact replicas, but rather interpretations that honored the spirit of the original moment while addressing contemporary accessibility challenges. The festival also served as a testing ground for new accessibility technologies and methodologies. Inventors, designers, and researchers used the event to demonstrate their latest innovations and gather feedback from users with diverse abilities. Many technologies that later became standard features in entertainment venues were first tested at the Elvis and Amy Festival. Amy's children carried forward her legacy in their own careers. Her daughter became a physician specializing in deaf health issues, working to ensure that medical care was accessible and culturally appropriate for deaf patients. Her son became a technology entrepreneur, developing applications and devices that made digital content more accessible to users with various disabilities. Both children spoke frequently about how their mother's experience with Elvis had taught them that accommodation wasn't charity but justice, and that true inclusion required understanding and respecting different ways of experiencing the world. Their work contributed to policy changes and technological innovations that benefited millions of people with disabilities worldwide. The philosophical implications of Amy's story continued to influence academic discourse as well. Scholars in disability studies, philosophy, and aesthetic theory used her experience as a case study in discussions about the nature of artistic experience and the relationship between different senses and types of perception. Her story challenged traditional assumptions about what constituted normal or complete artistic experience, suggesting that different ways of perceiving art might offer unique insights rather than inferior approximations of a standard experience. This thinking influenced how artists, critics, and scholars approached questions about accessibility, inclusion, and the fundamental nature of aesthetic experience. Museums and galleries worldwide began reconsidering their approaches to exhibition design, inspired by Amy's visual approach to music. Audio tours were supplemented with tactile experiences. Visual displays were designed to be meaningful to visitors with visual impairments, and interactive elements were created that could be enjoyed through multiple senses. The Amy Thompson Guidelines for Accessible Arts Programming became industry standards for cultural institutions, providing specific recommendations for making performances, exhibitions, and educational programs inclusive for individuals with diverse abilities. These guidelines were updated regularly to incorporate new technologies and evolving understanding of disability and accessibility. Law schools began teaching courses on disability rights that included Amy's story as an example of how individual advocacy could lead to systemic change. Her experience with Elvis demonstrated how personal connections and understanding could be more powerful than legislation alone in creating lasting social transformation. Legal advocates used Amy's story to argue for stronger accessibility requirements in entertainment venues, educational institutions, and public spaces. The Americans with Disabilities Act was strengthened partly due to advocacy efforts that cited examples like Amy's to demonstrate both the need for accessibility and the benefits of inclusive design. The psychological impact of Amy's story on other deaf children and their families was immeasurable. Countless parents reported that learning about Amy's experience had changed their expectations for their children and helped them advocate more effectively for educational and social opportunities. Support groups for families of deaf children often used Amy's story as a starting point for discussions about advocacy, inclusion, and helping children develop confidence in their unique abilities. The story provided hope and practical inspiration for families navigating the challenges of raising deaf children in a predominantly hearing world. Therapeutic programs for deaf children incorporated Amy's approach to visual music into treatment for various emotional and developmental challenges. Music therapy programs specifically designed for deaf clients used movement, color, and visual imagery to help children process emotions, develop social skills, and build confidence. The documentary Seeing Music: The Elvis and Amy Story continued to be shown in schools, universities, and community organizations decades after its initial release. Updated versions included additional information about the long-term impact of their meeting and featured interviews with individuals whose lives had been changed by Amy's example. International film festivals began featuring accessibility-focused programming, screening films about disability rights and inclusion alongside mainstream entertainment. The Elvis and Amy documentary won numerous awards and inspired other filmmakers to explore stories about disability, difference, and the power of human connection. As Amy entered her later years, she reflected on the unexpected trajectory her life had taken since that September night in What had begun as a child's desire to experience an Elvis concert had grown into a lifetime of advocacy, education, and innovation that had touched millions of lives. In interviews, Amy consistently emphasized that her story wasn't unique because she was exceptional, but because Elvis had been willing to see her as she was and to learn from her perspective. She argued that similar moments of recognition and understanding could happen every day if people were willing to look beyond their assumptions and truly see each other. Her final major project was a comprehensive archive of materials related to deaf accessibility in the arts, housed at the Smithsonian Institution. The archive included not just documentation of her own experiences, but thousands of stories from other deaf individuals who had found their own ways to connect with music, theater, dance, and other performance arts. The archive served as both a historical record and a resource for researchers, advocates, and artists working to create more inclusive cultural experiences. It demonstrated that Amy's story was part of a much larger narrative about human creativity, adaptation, and the many different ways people could find meaning and beauty in artistic expression. Today, the principles that emerged from Elvis and Amy's brief but transformative encounter continue to influence how we think about accessibility, inclusion, and the fundamental nature of human connection. Their story reminds us that difference should be celebrated rather than merely tolerated, that understanding requires genuine curiosity and respect, and that the most profound art speaks to hearts and souls in ways that transcend any single sense or ability. The legacy of that September night lives on in every accessible concert venue, every sign language interpreter at a performance, every technology that helps people experience art in new ways, and every moment when someone takes the time to truly see and appreciate another person's unique perspective on the world. Elvis and Amy proved that music truly is a universal language, one that speaks to every heart willing to listen with more than just their ears. The preservation of their story has become an important part of both entertainment history and disability rights documentation. The Elvis Presley estate works closely with deaf advocacy organizations to ensure that Graceland and other Elvis-related sites are fully accessible to visitors with disabilities. Tours are available in American Sign Language, and exhibits include tactile and visual elements that allow deaf visitors to experience Elvis's story and music in meaningful ways. Academic conferences on disability studies regularly feature presentations about the Elvis and Amy encounter, analyzing it from perspectives ranging from sociology and psychology to performance studies and accessibility design. Scholars continue to find new insights in their interaction, discovering lessons that apply to contemporary challenges in inclusion and social justice. The story has also influenced international approaches to accessibility. Countries around the world have cited Amy's experience as evidence of the importance of inclusive design in cultural venues. UNESCO now includes accessibility guidelines inspired partly by Amy's story in its recommendations for cultural heritage sites and performance venues. Professional development programs for performers now include training on how to interact effectively with audience members who have disabilities. These programs emphasize the importance of genuine respect and curiosity rather than pity or condescension, using Elvis and Amy's relationship as a model of authentic connection across difference. The continuing evolution of assistive technology keeps Amy's vision alive in new and innovative ways. Smart contact lenses that can translate sound into visual patterns, neural implants that allow direct brain interface with musical information, and augmented reality systems that overlay visual music onto live performances all trace their conceptual origins back to Amy's pioneering work in experiencing music through alternative sensory channels. As society continues to grapple with questions of inclusion, diversity, and accessibility, the story of Elvis Presley and Amy Thompson remains as relevant today as it was nearly 50 years ago. Their brief encounter demonstrated that barriers between people are often more imaginary than real, and that genuine understanding can emerge when we approach each other with openness, curiosity, and respect for the unique gifts that every person brings to our shared human experience.